I wanted to do a region embossed front panel for a greeting card. You will need a cutting machine to make the template in any case, unless you're very, very good at fussy cutting, which I'm definitely not. But here is how you actually construct the file. Now I am using shortcuts a lot. You can do exactly the same thing if you're using Brothers Canvas Workspace. You just need to do the same type of steps. The first thing we have is this image here, which I've created, and I've colored everything in red. The reason for that is because this is something that I am actually going to cut out. So I'm just going to cut the rectangle out. But all this little lot is actually draw lines. If I go to my preview button on here, you can see draw lines are in blue. So all this lot is being drawn. Now this is done so that I can put the card in my cutter, I can draw the design, I can cut around the outside edge, and then I can colour it in however I please. So that's pretty simple. Now this one is slightly different because if you look very carefully, if I zoom in here, you will see that there are a couple of layers. Now all I did was I started off with this layer here. I duplicated it another couple of times so that I had 3 identical layers. Now the first thing to notice is that this has got the handle going on the right hand side and this has got the handle going on the left hand side. Very, very important if you're doing this by cutting machine. It needs to be reversed when you cut the template, because if you don't, it's not going to line up. Everything's going to be completely wrecked. So your drawing, if your drawing goes in one direction and then you flip it, and it's easy enough to do in here, you just come over to this section here and do a flip to do the actual cutting and the embossing. Okay, so the cutting and the embossing are done in the same direction. The drawing is done in the opposite direction. So if we look at my layers here, you can see that I have a group which is coloured. Now this area where I've got coloured in pink is draw lines, and they have been made with an interior offset of the cut lines. I'm putting in a little insert here because I went slightly wrong with my file yesterday and I just wanted to point something out. In the case of this mug, where you have an object which is basically going to be cut out and then another object inside it that has to be cut out, this piece of the stencil actually stays on the mat, this interior hole. You need it there. But that means that you need 3 lines around this area. You want the piece that cuts out basically what is the whole of the handle in the mug. You need the other line which forms the handle itself of the mug. And then in between that, you need the actual embossing line. That's why I've coloured this one pink so that you can actually see it. Just to make it even clearer, I am going to zoom in still further. So that pink line is the embossing line. The other 2 lines are cut lines. But as I mentioned, when you're making the stencil and you've got it on the mat, you don't take this piece of plastic away. The piece that you weed is the whole cup. That piece of plastic stays there, and that enables this embossing line to work properly. If you take this out, you haven't got anything for the embossing tool to create pressure against and basically to stretch the card. So that has to stay there, and you have to have the 3 lines in order to make it work. Not difficult at all, just takes a little bit of getting your head around, and it's always the middle line that is going to be the embossing one. Now back to the rest of the video. When you send this to your cutter, if you look at the different layers, hang on a second, if I do a preview it's probably easy. to see, if I move this out of the way, you can see my blue lines are my draw lines, or what's actually going to be embossing lines. So what's going to happen is I'm going to put a piece of, it happens to be binder plastic, book binding plastic, onto my mat. And first of all, I am going to cut all these red bits. Now, all I need to do is to send it to my scan and cut and tell it to do a cut, and it's going to cut. So it'll cut the correct file as long as I send it as an FCM. If I were to send it as an SVG, I would have to dedicate the lines afterwards. So it's far easier if I'm designing in Shortcuts a lot to send it as an FCM, and then I get the result that I want. So I will be doing the cut line. That will give me what is basically a stencil. Now, if you're going to be doing the embossing on the machine, you leave that stencil in place. Do not remove it from the mat. What you do is you put your drawn image, which is this one here, over the top of it face down, and you tape it in place. And then you tell the machine to do the embossing or the drawing of this file, not this one, this one. Okay, so this one you do first. You can take that off the mat, you can colour it, do whatever you want to it, stamp it, paint it, alcohol markers, whatever you want to do with it, you can do with that one. But then when you put your plastic down, or your heavy duty card, because you can do it with a thick card if you want to keep that card on there. You weed it while it is on the mat. Do not remove it. And then you take this piece here, and I'm just going to click on that. You flip it over face down on top of this one here to do the embossing lines. And then when you remove it from the machine, you will have your coloured images embossed. It takes a little while to get used to the concept of doing it, but it's not hard to do. If you do not have a manual embossing machine, this will give you a pretty good embossing. If you do have a manual embossing machine and you want to do it normally, then just use the stencil itself to put through the embossing machine, and you'll get the same kind of result. So that's how you actually design the file. So you want 3 of the same design, one of which is flipped over to do the drawing or painting, whatever it is you're going to do. Now, if you want to do it with an image that you have stamped, then presumably you can put your stamped image into the scanning part of the scan and cut, and you can get your cut lines from that, and you can proceed in a similar manner. I'm going to send this little lot to my cutting machine, and I'll come back and show you the result. So this is what my card looks like before I do the embossing. I've just used some alcohol markers on the mug, the stars, and the steam there. And the little sort of snowflakey dot type things I've done with a Sakura glitter pen, which doesn't have any colour to it at all. Here's my finished card. I'm happy with the embossing. I don't know if it shows that very well on camera. I can certainly see it here. I've added a marker line around the outside of my panel, and I've added a few metallic gems, but other than that I'm done. I won't add a sentiment until I've decided who's going to get the card. So that's one done. I have another version here, which is a simpler way of doing things entirely, because you don't have to line up the embossing with any drawing. So in this case, all I've done is I've taken a panel, I have stamped it with some images, done a bit of colour blending, put a line around the outside again, and then I put it over this stencil on my mat and did the embossing. Again, you put an interior offset onto all these shapes, and then you just set it to emboss. You do have to remember to keep it on the mat still, because if you don't, you've got to line everything up, and that's more difficult to do. I topped it off with a 2-layer greeting. The layer underneath this is actually cut from the same plastic as the stencil is cut, because it gives it quite a lot of stability. And that's it. I'm very happy with the result. I think it's come out really nicely. You can try doing embossing with the pen holders with one of these styluses. This is actually a nail dotting tool. They're very cheap to buy them in sets of 5 different sizes, points. And if you've the small barrel brother holder, in order to use this in here, you need to put something to let it grip onto. So either wrap it round with some masking tape, something of that ilk that has a little bit of texture for it to grip onto, because otherwise it tends to slide. It doesn't grip it hard enough. You can put a stencil like this with your front panel and put it through a Gemini embossing machine or whatever embossing machine you have. If you can emboss with stencils, then you can do it that way. If you want to go full on manual mode, then all you do is you use this as a stencil on one side of your card and you just draw your picture. You turn it over, make sure to flip the design and do it on the back manually, and then you can do your manual embossing as well. If you haven't got a cutting machine, you'll just have to buy a stencil or use one that you have in your stash, because trying to cut these manually is not easy. Well, not unless you're very skilled with a craft knife, and I'm definitely not one of those. Okay, that's it for today. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you again soon. Take care.